a lie. People don't know me. I don't even know myself.
I gotta ask the
Who am
questions,
I?
cause that's the only way that I know.
Hail to the primal light, all is myself, I alone exist. Welcome and thank you for joining me today. I am Primal Light, prepared for the world with the identity of Set. I am the daughter of the Self-Supreme, Primal Light, liberator and advocate for all selves. Today, I am talking about stillness and self-inquiry. Who am I? How did I come into being? What is the source of my existence? So, how do I bring balance and harmony within myself? So, we're talking about self-inquiry, stillness and self-inquiry. Your baby self called the spirit and your mind now exists like this. It's on one sheet. Your mind is in the front and your baby self is hiding, obscure behind the mind. The baby self on the mind was kind of like playing hide and go seek, right? So the problem is the mind has forgotten to go and find the baby self that is hiding behind it. This character that you're playing, this is just like the character that the avatar that the mind dreams of to play a role for itself. So the mind wanted to explore the world. So what it did, it makes a trick with the self, with your baby self. And they tell the baby self, we're going to play hide and seek. You go hide and I'll come and find you. But the mind, over many lifetimes, the mind has forgotten, because each lifetime you get a clean slate. Each time when you come in, you forget, you forget what, your whole purpose and your whole reason. And so this is what's happening. So it's kind of like you are the actor in a movie, you're playing a character and you stay in the character and you forget to return back to being your real self. So now as the mind, you must go and find yourself that is hiding behind you, sleeping obscure behind the mind. The mind has to go find itself that is obscure behind it, because the mind is just thoughts and imagination. And the mind is just using its imagination to create an avatar to explore the world. So the avatar has taken precedence in the body over your real self, and this is why your mind now has to come into a realization that it did this. And so it has to go to seek and find the real self. It has to go back now to find the real self. So growing up as human beings, we are only taught to listen and exist only in the mind. Therefore, within us there's an imbalance, because you are the self-intelligence and you are not the mind. Remember, the mind is what? The mind is thought and the mind is imagination, right? So everything that you're creating, you're using your imagination. So your mind is thoughts, creation, imagination. So you are the self-intelligence and you are not the mind. The mind is thought and imagination aspect of yourself. The mind intelligence dwells in the head, and the self-intelligence dwells in the heart, in the center of the chest, right here. So remember that inside of the body, you have two selves. You have the real self, which is the parent self, the soul, and the baby self, which is what we call the spirit. The baby self is the one that is animating the body with using its mind, and its mind has tricked it, and it's a baby mind. It's a baby mind and a baby self, and the parent self is in the body, and this is where it dwells. It dwells in the self heart, right in the center of your chest here. That's where the parent self dwells, that we call the soul, and the mind dwells with the baby self, and they're on one sheet. They're on one sheet just like this, with the self being obscure behind the mind, and the mind has forgotten that it was playing hide and seek with the self, and the self has forgotten itself because it's sleeping and it's caught up in the loop of the imagination of its mind. So all the things is playing out, and it doesn't realize that it is sleeping. It doesn't realize that it's in a dream, and only when the self wakes up, it's going to realize that it's in a dream. And this is the reason why stillness and self-inquiry is so essential.
Time to wake up.
As you can see, like I just showed you, the duality consciousness being the consciousness, the mind is in front and the self is hiding behind, right? You are the self, you are the light, you are the hiding behind the mind, and the mind has taken precedent over the self. So the mind is in front and yourself is hiding behind the mind. This is a major problem because the mind thinks it is the real self, and it has forgotten that the real self exists in the body, and the baby self, its real self, exists behind it. It has forgotten that. So you, the real self, and your mind now exist on this one thin sheet. There is no space, no void between yourself and the mind. You need to have void to separate yourself from the mind so that the mind doesn't obscure you and take over. Your mind has been the ruler of you, and now you must self-inquire to engage your mind to seek its real self. This is why you have to self-inquire. It is very important that you do so. The duality consciousness being. So when the self is obscure behind the consciousness and the self is on one thin sheet. Consciousness cannot see itself, and there is no space between the self, the light, and the consciousness. The light and the self is obscure behind the consciousness. Because remember that the consciousness is your mind, but you are, the baby self has the baby mind. You, the baby self, that's animated in the body now as the baby mind. The light and the self is obscure behind the consciousness, behind the mind. Therefore, the mind thinks it does not have any light, and that it is the self. So it goes about trying to imitate the self as being the self, and it also the consciousness. What the consciousness do is try to steal others' light because it is dark and it doesn't see its light, right? Dominating the self with its magnetic power and strength. So that's what the consciousness does. So because the consciousness cannot see its light. So imagine playing hide and seek, right? And the seeker forgets about you and never comes to find you. You realize that no one is coming to find you, so you come out of hiding. The problem is that for the real self cannot come out of hiding by itself. It needs the mind. It needs the mind to know that it is not the real self. It needs the mind to come into awareness. It needs the mind to come into awareness that it is hiding the self behind itself and is obscuring its light. It needs the mind to come to this. So that this is why self-inquiry is so very important. Self-inquiry gets the mind engaged to go and seek the self, the real self, and it gets the mind to come to self-realization that it is not a self, but that it is a mind. Because remember, the mind uses its imagination to dream up an avatar, and the avatar is the one that we call the ego, the false self, the fake self that's in the body right now, that it's in the body, and you think that it is yourself, but it is an avatar from the mind. So, and the real self is what? Sleeping obscure behind the mind. And so we have to self-inquire to wake up the sleeping self, to get the mind engaged to go to find the self. So the baby self is sleeping and got caught up in imagination, kind of like, when you as the mind exploring right now, you're sleeping and dreaming. And when you're dreaming, do you have any awareness that you're dreaming? Do you know that you are in a dream? You have no idea that you're in a dream. And so this is the reason why you have to self-inquire, to get the mind to go and seek the self. So the mind and the self, it's playing hide and go seek. Your mind likes to play games. It also likes to play tricks on yourself. That is what it did when it told the self to hide behind it and it would come and seek it soon. It was a trick so that the mind could get the chance to dream up and imagine an avatar to explore the world instead of its real self. This is the fake self that you are exploring the world in, that has taken precedence over the real self. And right now, this self is called the ego self. It is time for the ego self to return back into the mind and for the real self to awake from obscurity, from hiding behind the mind. It's time for the real self now to come into awareness and to wake up, and so that this avatar can return back into the mind. Self-inquiry. What is self-inquiry? Self-inquiry is when we're asking questions of ourselves. We take our question to who? To our intelligent self. Because remember, we're always asking and dwelling in the mind. But are we the mind? No. You are not the mind, and you are not this body, right? So self-inquiry wakes up your sleeping baby self, so it can know that it is inside of a dream. Because remember, when you're dreaming right now, you don't know that you're dreaming until you wake up. You realize that what was happening to you was a dream, right? Am I right? So it's the same thing with the self. The self is in the dream and the self is sleeping, but the self doesn't know that it is inside of a dream. And the only way it's going to know that is when it wakes up. So self-inquiry is how you wake up the self. So who am I? What is this I? How did I come into being? Self-inquiry is the key. From where does this thought arise? We have to get into the habit of self-inquiring and asking every time a thought arises. We have to get into the habit of asking from where the thought arises. What difference it would make if we seek the origin of every thought that arises. You have to seek the origin of every thought, just so that you can know who is the thinker. Because you want to know, is it the ego self? Is it just coming from your mind? Or is it coming from your real self? Self-inquiry is the single most important thing you can do to attain self-truth. When we want to do something, we want to make a decision, instead of dwelling into the mind and seeking the answers from the mind, we just sit in stillness and ask the self-intelligence. It is time to balance the mind in the heart. It is time for you to seek your truth from your intelligence self. Self-inquiry. Your amazing intelligence baby self wants to come out of hiding. It does not want to remain hiding behind your mind. What do you say? We put some space, void between your baby self and your mind. But how do I put some space between my real self and my mind? It's really simple how to put space between your baby self and your mind, so that your mind will stop thinking and acting as if it is the self. What to do is so simple that we overlook it. We only must self-inquire. That's really simple, right? We only must self-inquire to get the mind engaged to seek its source of existence. You have to get the mind engaged to seek its source of existence. To self-inquire means you are asking yourself and no one else. To ask yourself and no one else, you must first find a quiet place and sit in stillness to still your mind, so that you can listen to your intelligent self. Who am I? What is this I? How did I come into being? What is the source of my existence, allowing me this world experience? Where did I come from? Where do I go after I leave here? It's time now for you to seek your truth from your intelligent self, for all selves. I want to thank you for joining me today, because the next thing that I want to talk about is sickness of the mind, mental sickness. Because right now, look at what's happening in the world. We have had over 2 years of COVID situation, And people have still not come into this realization of our existentiality. People have still not come into this understanding of our immortality and of our eternal self. So instead of people are still dwelling in the mind, worshiping the mind, because right now, why is one country waging war against another country? They're doing this because the mind is sick. And because the changes are happening in the world, is going to affect all beings. So there are lots of crazy things that are going to happen within the minds of everyone. And this is the reason why stillness and self-inquiry in this point in time is so vital and important. Everyone in the world should be practicing stillness and self-inquiry right now, because COVID should teach all of us that we need to just go inward to ourselves and try to understand ourselves. Instead of doing that, the mind is so sick that it's just going out there and doing a lot of crazy things. They're dwelling into the mind too much. And the mind needs to be still, needs to be purified. You are exploring the world as the mind. You think you are the mind. You dwell in the mind. You ask all your questions of the mind. And the time has come when we have to know that we have to bring the mind to balance. The mind is sick and the mind needs to be healed. And when you dwell in your mind too much, you make it worse. And so this is what's happening to all the people who are going out there doing all of these negative things in the world. Right now, everyone, I mean, seriously, I need all media, I need everyone to be sharing this. That is very, very important, that everyone needs to be practicing stillness and self-inquiry. This should be mandated in the culture right now. This should be mandated in the culture, that everyone is sitting down to still the mind, to bring purity to the mind, so that people can really get a grasp on themselves. Because if you are constantly exploring the world in the mind right now is very confused, because like I said, this world is coming to a close. The duality is coming to a close, and all the selves that are sleeping has to wake up. So the mind is very confused, and so the minds of the human beings do not understand themselves, and they do not know this, and so they are going to go into the negative route of the mind, because the mind is already in a duality state and in an impure state. And if you're not sitting down in stillness and purifying your mind and bringing balance to it, then this chaos will continue. So we have to share this with everyone. This is so important. This is very vital that this is done. Okay, so I want to thank you so much. Please share that everyone have to practice stillness right now. This is very important. This is the most important thing you can do for anyone, is to share stillness and self-inquiry. Please do this, so that we can say goodbye to the earth in a proper manner, not in war, but in peace. We can bring peace within ourselves, and we can say goodbye to the earth in peace, and welcome the new, the non-duality. Please, let's do this.
Time to unify the self.